So it's good to be here, and I'm deeply appreciative of the way that the parish community has made me so welcome over the last week or so, and also very appreciative of your prayers over the past 6 weeks or so since my cancer diagnosis was discovered. Sometimes, and perhaps most of the time, things don't quite turn out as planned. Tomorrow night was to be the installation, but it's all rescheduled, and I'm here and we'll pick up the installation after the surgery and everything else. I can now add that I've heard from the hospital and the surgery is scheduled for Friday, October 20, which is probably better than the week before, Friday, October 13. So at least I know the date, and we'll discover what they've done with me when I wake up and how well I cope with it. Normally, I would tend to focus on the gospel readings, and that reading we just heard is a cracker because it offends us just as much as it offended the guys who'd worked all through the heat and got the same pay as everybody else. But in fact, I'm choosing for these first 4 weeks to take advantage of the fact that we're working our way through Philippians. I'll say a little bit more about that at the moment, but we're doing a series of 4 sermons looking at Philippians 1, Philippians 2, and so on, till we get to the end of the book. So we will have worked our way through the whole of Philippians by the middle of October. As it happened, I was in the Cathedral in August last year, visiting Australia as part of my role and my work as Dean of St George's College in Jerusalem. Then as now, I bring you greetings from the church in the Holy Land. And then as now, I urge you to never forget to pray for the peace of Jerusalem and always to hold the Christians of that land in your hearts. They're doing it tough. It's a tough call to be a Christian person in the Middle East, and especially in Israel and Palestine. So from time to time I will remind you of that, but I hope that you will be keeping them in your prayers in any case. As I mentioned, over the next couple of weeks we have a series of readings from Paul's letter to the very young, fledgling Christian community in the city of Philippi, named after Philip, who was the father of Alexander the Great. So you get a sense of the history of this place. It was about 350 to 380 years old as a city when Paul went there. He was only in the place for a couple of weeks before he got chased out of town. You might not think that's a very successful ministry. If I was chased out of town by the magistrates next weekend, you'd probably think that was not a very good choice as dean. But Paul had a profound impact on those people, and that's partly what we're going to be exploring today. So over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be dipping into the different chapters of this letter to the Philippians, probably written about 25 years after Easter. So it's not only one of the earliest letters of Paul, it's actually one of the oldest Christian writings that exists. Only 1 Thessalonians is earlier, about a year or so earlier. Not only that, but as we'll see next week, in chapter 2 of Philippians, in order to make his point, Paul quotes from a hymn that they used to sing in Philippi when they came together for church. So actually the letter preserves an even older piece of information, a little snippet of the prayer life or the worship life. I'm not sure they had a fine director of music like we have, but they sang songs and they used music in their community worship. In that poem, or as he introduces that poem, that hymn, which we'll look at next week, Paul is urging the Philippians to have the same mind, attitude, the mindset, the same mind that Christ himself had. And so I'm taking that idea of the mind of Christ as our kind of theme for these 4 weeks. This week we're looking at compassion, next week humility, the week after faithfulness, and the following week peace. And they may sound like very nice, safe, respectable, religious words. But behind the politeness of the English translations, there's some very strong words, particularly this week. And so I'm going to draw that to our attention. To think about compassion this week, we're thinking about the difficult circumstance that Paul and his friends in Philippi were sharing. He's actually writing from a really tough patch. He appears to be under arrest, yet again, parish council in Philippi probably said. He got into trouble with the police when he was here, and now that he's in Ephesus or Rome, wherever he was, guess what? He's back in the clink again. He's in trouble with the authorities. I'll try not to do that to you, okay? But he's writing to thank the Philippians because of their absolutely rock-solid support for him in his difficulty. They not only cared about him and prayed about him, they not only sent money to pay his expenses, they sent one of their church members, a fellow called Epaphroditus, it's a nice word to pronounce, to actually stay with Paul and be his gopher, be his personal assistant and run errands for him. As Paul thinks about the tough times he's been through and that they've shared together, he realises, with the benefit of hindsight, always a good thing, that the difficult circumstances they've shared have actually worked out for the good. And because of his incarceration, not only have they grown in love for each other, but the gospel has been shared much more broadly. And when he talks about their compassion for him in an earlier part of chapter 1, which we didn't read this morning, Paul uses a very vivid word, and a word that's not used very often in the Greek New Testament. It's the word splanknon. Now, you don't need to worry about the Greek word, but it's a word that means bowels or guts. Okay. And indeed, it's the word that's used in the story in Acts where Judas hangs himself and his innards burst out. This is the word that's used at that point. In the old King James Version of the Bible, they translated things much more bluntly. So that passage, Philippians 1:8, reads like this in the Authorized Version. For God is my record, how greatly I long after you all in the bowels of Christ. Okay? You might remember that turn of phrase. In fact, at the beginning of chapter 2, Paul uses it again. If therefore, I'm reading again from the King James, if there be therefore any consolation in Christ, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any bowels and mercies. Interesting, gutsy kind of language, we might say. These days we like to think that our care for each other comes from our heart. We're very romantic people. We think that our heart is where our feelings live. That the Greeks knew that our feelings were actually down here. Okay? And we know that as well. When we hear really bad news or somebody treats us very badly, we might say, if we're not very polite, I feel like I've been kicked in the guts. And everybody knows what we mean. We might say, I hate that. It makes my stomach churn. I feel squeezy when I hear that bad news. We might even have to excuse ourselves and go to the bathroom. Whether it's good news or bad news, if it really matters to us, it's not just an idea, it's not just a feeling, it actually hits us in the gut. And Paul's gratitude to the good people at Philippi is not because they thought well of him, not because they cared, sent him hugs, it's because his bad circumstances hit them so hard that they went through the same physical turmoil that Paul himself was experiencing. Such physical expressions of sympathy, of course, reflect the closeness of their bond and of our bond with others when we react like that. A little later, and this is the passage we read this morning, we find Paul reciprocating as he expresses his own deep compassion for his friends in Philippi. He's been close to death and in some sense attracted to the possibility of dying. And he's reflecting on that in the passage that I read a little bit earlier. Life to me, of course, is Christ. But then death would be a positive gain. On the other hand, if to be alive in the body gives me opportunity for fruitful work, I don't know what I should choose. This is Paul, by the way, being amazingly personal and revealing his own personal spiritual struggle. I'm caught in this dilemma. I want to be gone and be with Christ. This is by far the stronger desire, and yet for your sake, to stay alive in this body is a more urgent need. This much I know for certain, I shall stay and stand by you all. Paul is reflecting deeply on the hardship he's been through, and he leaves us this very personal, intimate expression of his own dilemma. Feels close to death. He'd really like to die. He finds that an attractive option to be with Christ, and yet he knows his friends in Philippi still need him. And the bond is so strong. The compassion that binds them together is so strong that he wants to remain. This week, we're beginning a new partnership in ministry here in Grafton as I come among you as your dean. Authentic solidarity and genuine compassion, like we find in Philippians chapter 1, are key attributes of the faith that we already share and of the church community we're seeking to nurture. Imagine if the cathedral was famous around Grafton because of the compassion that we have for each other, because of the genuine, heartfelt, gut-wrenching compassion we actually share for each other. Imagine if that compassion extended beyond the fellowship of our parish community to embrace the whole city itself. And beyond that, imagine if we were known as people who are so passionate and so gutsy in our commitment to social justice, in our work for peace, and in our care for God's beautiful environment. I wonder if we'd have a different kind of profile in the civic community. None of this is about having the answers. We have some answers, and we certainly have deep spiritual wisdom to share with our neighbours. But it's not about having the answers. It's not about power or status. And it's certainly not about being correct. But it is about taking a lesson from Philippians chapter 1 and becoming compassionate people. People who move far beyond good ideas and warm feelings to stand in total solidarity with one another and with the people who are doing it tough at the present time. As we come to the table of Christ this morning, let's ask for the grace to have that mind of Christ in us today, tomorrow, and always. Amen.